And to be faithful to this legal tradition, it just dawned deep in my core that it's about bringing about a social vision, because all of fiqh is really a social map, more than it is just a personal code. And we have in the modern world, for reasons that might be obvious, we've reduced it in many cases to a personal code. What can I or can I not do? That's the end of what I need to know about fiqh.
But when the Prophet reaches Medina, he gets the opportunity to build systems out of those frameworks. What was that system?
Zakat, according to the Sunnah, is one of the most important engines of creating the form of structured community that we've been labeling as building Medina. And that's what tax always does. Another part of what Zakat is achieving just through its rules is that no one should be sitting on liquid wealth. Either circulate it through the real economy or give a share of it to the poor.
How do I treat from the very moment the Prophet got the Wahi to the last moment of his life, all those 23 years are sacred? And how do I abstract all of it in a way that I can reconfigure it?
But we treat the mosque as exceptional. But no, the mosque is the entire Sharia. Medina is nothing more, if you want to say the will of Mecca, Medina is nothing more than the will of the mosque.
What is Zakat correcting in terms of inequalities, in terms of what is it solving as a problem?
But the human being that Zakat is creating naturally then is being taken on a journey in that education. A journey of responsibility to place, responsibility to people who are struggling, and a journey of wanting to give more. Because if you look at the civilization Zakat unlocked, its great champion was actually Waqf, which has nothing to do with Zakat.
Dr. Sohail Hanif is the Chief Executive Officer at the National Zakat Foundation of UK. He works on Islamic legal theory with a focus on the Hanafi School of Law. He received an MA and DPhil from the University of Oxford. His doctoral thesis studies the interplay of rationality and tradition in a major work of legal commentary. Sohail has also spent over a decade in Jordan, where he studied a full curriculum of Islamic sciences with traditional ulama. He was previously the head of Arabic sciences at Qasid Arabic Institute in Amman, BA program manager and lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College, and an instructor in Islamic studies at Qibla Online Academy. Additionally, he has taught undergraduate classes on modern Islam and Quranic studies at the University of Oxford. He has also served as the head of research and development at the National Zakat Foundation. You were doing this hardcore academic teaching, writing, and then you thought, the prophetic model, is it about only armchair intellectualism, or is it institutionalizing those ideas into frameworks that can be embodied and that could translate into day-to-day life? And of course, you found Zakat as that pillar, as that institutional framework, where you thought that a lot of what Islam intends to do in terms of organizing the society, changing the dynamics of how the world is organized between people, especially given the context that we know today, we have been suffering from the highest inequalities throughout the history of, human beings. If you remember even COVID, a pandemic of that scale where we were reminded of that kind of inequality, what we ended up, producing is much more starker inequality and wars and pandemics and everything. Why did you think, with your broad background in fiqh, that zakat is that institutional framework wherein you could bring that change from a broader Islamic paradigm?
Thank you very much. What can I say? Since I was 17, I think I've been very interested in understanding what you could broadly call traditional Islamic studies. And I think halfway through that journey, I had some teachers who influenced me a lot, and I felt at that stage that academic work to develop my own, deeper frameworks of how to engage with fiqh would be helpful for me. And that's what took me back to university and the PhD. Then at Cambridge Muslim College, I was lecturing for 4 years, and to a group of very intelligent students, we went through the whole set of classical fiqh, from the the worship of it, to the trade and marriage of it, to the jihad of it, to the hudud of it, to the slavery of it. And so we were really, the blood money, we were really thinking throughout this whole spectrum of topics. First of all, what does it mean to reason jurisprudentially with these topics? Meaning it's not legal statements to be memorized, but they're conveying some information about thinking, about reasoning, about a craft of jurisprudence. So how do you access a craft out of these statements? But then secondly, we reflected throughout, what does this all really mean in the world then and in the world today? So then there's like a triangle. What's the craft of reasoning across each of these topics? And then as you develop that craft and insight, what would this have all meant in an old world? And what could this mean in a new world? And as we did this over the years, it just dawned deeper and deeper and deeper on me. Something that we might know, but sometimes it's different to know something and to really feel something in your core, perhaps. That it went very deep in my core, that to be faithful, and faithfulness was always a very important word to me. What does it mean to be true to this tradition? Because sometimes we parrot off a tradition, but then you have to ask yourself, is this what it was really about? Are you being faithful in just quoting words? Or does faithfulness mean deeply taxing yourself to understand what is really being conveyed? So faithfulness was a word that meant a lot to me. And to be faithful to this legal tradition, it just dawned deep in my core that it's about bringing about a social vision, because all of fiqh is really a social map, more than it is just a personal code. And we have in the modern world, for reasons that might be obvious, we've reduced it in many cases to a personal code. What can I or can I not do? That's the end of what I need to know about fiqh. And then when you go through a fiqh study, the goal is to be a teacher, which is odd, because the goal should be that the craft enables you to do something, not just a rinse and repeat in the classroom. So I think there's a lot of structural problems in how we envisage this discipline of classical Islamic law or Sharia. And so it was that, and then I thought to myself, my goal is to prepare students who should go out in the world, be lawyers, be activists, be this, be that. I'll just teach and inform you. And so it was a strange set of affairs that led to me, myself being the one, if you like, to go out in the world with very little, I thought, worldly experience. And the opportunity presented itself in Zakat. That's all I would say. But as I've been in this space, I do really believe that Zakat really allows us to move the conversation from the community building that mosques allow for to really the next level of a structured, organized, empowered, orderly Muslim community. And it is noteworthy that Zakat and Salat have always been the most emphasized of the pillars and, if you like, the foundational institutions of an Islamic community. Last thing I'll say before I hand back to you, the mirrors and differences between what you might call a Western minority context and an Indian minority context. Because I remarked to you when we met that it's a shame how much, when Westerners look at minorities for a shared conversation, they often don't extend their thinking towards a place like India, where you have a huge minority with a great history, ancient institutions, an indigenous scholarly tradition, and then challenges which in many ways far outweigh existentially, possibly, and we can explore that, challenges that we face in some of our Western minority contexts. And I really hoped that having an equal or shared conversation might produce learnings for both of our contexts.
Before moving on to specifically talking about Zakat and one of your lectures that I heard, the map of Medina, it really moved me in the sense that I've always been motivated towards thinking structurally about things and issues, not just talking about, of course, I'm very moved towards abstract thinking, but what is that abstract thinking, developing in this world? And in that context, my interest in philosophy always has created that anxiety within me of the relationship between falsafa, aqidah, and madhab. I mean, where from abstract philosophical ideals to restrained philosophical thinking within the frame of Islamic paradigm to actually methodologically applying them into system building from the perspective of institutions, but also from the perspective of individual nafs. So in that context, you having very unique backgrounds of one, an engineer, the second, informal training in actually, fiqh, Hanafi law, and everything, and then your background in Oxford as somebody who's thinking about this from much deeper first principle perspective than a traditional ulama would do, and then finally you becoming this institution builder itself, or becoming part of that institution. How does this anxiety between the world of ideas, the restriction imposed within those world of ideas with the framework that Islam or Quran introduces, and then channelizing those thoughts into actionable programs? How do you navigate that?
I'm navigating it by not calling it anxiety. A friend once told me, I went through a period, I always say that, to really be able to create within the knowledge that you have, to create ideas, you always have to learn within a tradition. Because if you can't learn within a tradition, then you can't really benefit from people before you. And at some point, you have to step out of that mold which has trained you to analyze from first principles what this experience has been. And are there other frameworks that you could benefit from? So there's always this period of growing in a mold or climbing up a ladder, and then analyzing the mold or the ladder, and if you like, breaking some of your premises, and then having to rebuild yourself again from what you've deeply understood. That's a very painful thing, the act of unlearning after learning. But everyone I've deeply respected has gone through some form of this. And I remember going through this once, and I was speaking to a friend. I said, I'm going through a lot of doubt. I'm doubting this, doubting that. And he said, no. He said, don't call it doubt, call it yaqeen. This is what he said, call it certainty. You're going deeper into certainty. And I found that a very deep thing that my friend told me, because sometimes the way you label your own ideas does actually influence how you take them and how you emotionally react to them. So though I said this as a joke, but there's a truth in it. Labeling a sort of returning to certitude, a doubt, is quite unsettling. And labeling, bringing worlds together in a synthetic way, labeling that anxiety could be unsettling as well. Anyway, so I would say that as my...
Definitely, that's what usually happens, that after you're going through this phase of really thinking about things from structural perspective, that it's the yaqeen, it's the the belief beyond faith that you are invested in this framework, and it has given you 99% of the answers, and in time it would give you that 1% as a lived experience. So what is this map of Medina, wherein the foundational thinking that I saw was Zakat or pillars of Islam as civilizational projects rather than atomized individuals' modes of beings. So as a civilizational project, what is the difference? How do you differentiate what the Prophet did in terms of building these institutions as recursive or repeating frameworks even after he passed away?
One last thing, if you don't mind, on your last question, beyond the labeling of it as not labeling it as anxiety. I've had the good fortune of not thinking too much beyond the step that is in front of me. Meaning, if I'm trying to understand, because what does it mean to go towards yaqeen? It means to understand your knowledge system from first principle. Because when you're learning, you kind of surrender to something, so you can study, but you kind of have to collapse it to its first principle so it can be a truly deep internalized thinking system. Otherwise, it's not yours and you can't create with it. This is the problem. This is what I mean by looking for certitude. And as you look for certitude, I think what I've been fortunate with is I only know what my next step is in front of me. So at one stage it was finding a different teacher and challenging myself in that framework. At another time it was I need to almost state these first principles, and I think an academic environment will help me. And as I produced that, I felt the best thing now is to start educating myself and others within first principles so I can understand how that journey is. And alongside that, then became this next journey of actually building an institution out of the system that I'm deeper understanding at a deeper level now that requires institution building. And so in this idea, one is more, what I say is, you kind of want to, at least in this discipline of fiqh, I say you want to surrender to the fiqh. You want to let it lead you and not you lead it. It will, like all knowledge, it takes you on a journey and you kind of have to surrender to that journey. There's an inquiry, there's an understanding, and so you're just taking it one step at a time. You're not, what I tell students is never put a label on yourself. Don't say I'm a teacher, I'm not a this, or I'm a writer, I'm not. Don't ever say not to yourself. Just follow the journey. And as you follow the journey of knowledge, it might take you into writing, it might take you into teaching, it might take you into activism. So I now start saying Sharia is all activism. Such a strange thing to say now. It might take you into leadership. I've never CEO'd, I've never managed, I've never done, but now I am. Not because I was seeking it as an aspiration, it's because I was trying to follow the knowledge. And the knowledge just took me step on step in directions I never imagined. And I'm still not putting a ceiling on me. I'm not saying now I'm a CEO institution builder. The best thing is not to give yourself a fixed identity. Just call yourself, because we call it in Arabic, the phrase is talib al-ilm. So talib is about seeking, which is not always the same as finding. Meaning, you're taking step after step. And as you go closer to certitude, things will dawn on you and a time dawns on you. So I think knowledge will transform you to the core. And they always say, knowledge is the key to leadership and power. Knowledge is everything. Nothing is greater than knowledge. But what stops us are our own boxes, whether they are institutional, imaginary, social. The best thing in knowledge is don't have any boxes. Just sort of lower your head and see what steps come. Like now you're a podcaster, tomorrow you might be a president. You don't have to say, I'm just a philosopher. That's the power of ideas. They just drive individuals and societies and civilizations. But every human is a micro civilization. So just let the journey take you. So I said to one person, I feel like I'm that camel. I think it's the Qaswa. When the Prophet ﷺ entered Medina, which is your next question, they all wanted to host him. And or they wanted to, and he said to them, no, leave the camel alone, it's being instructed. And it's not clear to me, did the camel know I'm going to Abu Ayyub Ansari's house, which number is it? Or was the camel following a destiny? And when the camel was told to sit, it sat. And prior to that destiny, all the camel knew was one step after one step. And so I just feel if you look at it this way, also then there's no anxiety. It's just, this is what I'm understanding today. This is what I feel I have to do. And so even now at NZF, I'm fundamentally a talib ilm. I'm fundamentally trying to understand things. I'm a lifelong student. But that's taking me into a shape-shifting of identities. So all I'll say is for anyone listening is you don't have to box yourself. And you don't have to have anxiety, but you want to surrender to Allah and understand that Allah has a destiny for you. And if He's placed the love of knowledge in your heart, just realize knowledge is never dogma. Dogma is just a step towards knowledge. And let Allah guide you. If you make any institution or label or teacher as your ultimate guide, it's kind of like an idol that you've erected. Allah is your guide. And you have to surrender to the forms of guides He gives you, teacher after teacher and tradition after tradition, but allow Allah to guide you, and it's a beautiful journey of enjoyment, not of anxiety. That's all I want to say on that one.
A lot of profound things that you've said, and some things that are related to it, especially the fatigue of doing too many things also catches up in many people, and it's that curve that if you are specializing in something, the curve is that you gain too much too early and then it flattens out. And for people who are taking too many responsibility, too many key roles, the curve is almost the opposite. It just is flat in the beginning, and if you are able to move past those hurdles, then you might rise exponentially. And that's what the transition from Makkah to Medina is, in a sense, that it's from the metaphysics to masses. The Prophet took a while to nurture people and himself into this multifaceted personality. So I'm completely with you in that sense, philosophically speaking, and as a lived experience. So moving forward, Sohail, by this map of Medina, in a sense, that the Prophet with all of his followers and companions, what is Makkah representing is basically the internal system, the system internalized and embodied as human beings. For example, slavery. For example, how do you treat women? How do you treat poor? How do you treat everybody else in that sense? But it's not part of the structure of the governing structure of the society. But when the Prophet reaches Medina, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he gets the opportunity to build systems out of those frameworks. What was that system, especially in terms of zakat?
So if I start in general with what we've discovered or discussed so far, which is that I'm going to call it Islamic sacred law. I'm trying to force myself to say Sharia more, by the way, only because Sharia has turned into such a bad word, and I feel we have to rescue it. I mean, who are we to rescue the sacred terminology of the Quran? But it's just, we have to serve it, just because it's been hijacked into notions of barbarism and domination and things that are so antithetical, actually, to what the Sharia actually represents. But just to say, this system which we're calling Fiqh, Islamic law, Sharia, just this set of rules and laws, this is describing what was revealed in Medina. That's at the heart of it. I think prayer was, obligated fractionally before Medina, the migration. But if you really think about the whole set of systems, again, the first mosque, prayers, institutions, all in Medina. So if you really start thinking Sharia fiqh, you are just studying Medina right now. And that's when you start realizing that what is a fiqh book? It is the legal equivalent of walking through the streets of the Prophet's Medina, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's all it is. Because what's the significance of the hijrah? It's not the GPS of this town called Yathrib. That's not the significant part. The significant part of what the hijrah represents is not the oases or the date trees or the tribe of Aus as its history. None of this is consequential. These are just features. The consequential part of the Medina that the hijrah really instates, our calendar remembers, our civilization marks as our starting point, is civilization. It is a new order or a new way of living in the world. What is the essence of that way? It is the Sharia. That's it. The Sharia is the code of Medina. The Sharia is the constitution of Medina. The Sharia is the blueprint of Medina. Anything else that you might see in the history of those 10 blessed years, miraculously blessed years of our Prophet ﷺ in Medina, anything else you'll see is just the instantiation of these principles. If you like, it's the modeling of them in that time and place. But if you collapse the time and place to its core institutional pillars or blueprint, that is what you call Sharia. So you cannot therefore separate Sharia from civilization. And you cannot separate Islamic law from an entire vision of organizing a society. Socially, politically, economically. There is no separation. So, therefore we can say then, if you are a student of fiqh or a student of the Sharia, you are a student of the Prophet's Medina, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if we were to say that we are trying to serve the Sharia, not as an individual code, which is what I think we've fallen to nowadays, but to serve its vision, bring it into the world as we must in truth aspire to, then what are you trying to bring into the world? The Prophet's Medina. Okay. Therefore, what I've started saying to people is, if a fiqh book is lots of topics like prayer is obligatory, dhuhr is 4 rak'ahs, and marriage is offer and acceptance, micro statements of law, those micro statements lead to a macro statement, which is this entire set of statements should be brought into the world. And that's what I mean by saying, if you collapse the Sharia into a single instruction, I would like to suggest that single instruction would be, because Sharia is fundamentally a social political code or a social vision, then that one statement will be, build Medina wherever you are to the best of your ability. And I believe all the instructions of classical fiqh come underneath this. Because it is fundamental, if you were to think of it, it is a public and social code. Now, before I pass back to you, or maybe we can drill into this, Medina is a city. And so what the Prophet did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his time, he brought these pillars about. So prayer as institution, Jum'ah as institution, Zakat as institution. These two probably the greatest foundational ingredients. Then there was qada, arbitration as institution. There was, you could even say, marriage as institution, meaning how it's preserved by qada publicly. You have trade as institution. The second thing established in Medina after the mosque was the market, the free market. We had then leadership as institution, defense as institution. But what I also want to remind people of, why Sharia as domination is such a lie, you had the notion of structured communities as recognized institutions. Meaning, in the case of Medina, the Jewish communities were told, just self-organize, follow the Torah, go to your rabbis, organize your marriages, be respected and empowered and legally enforced in your own codes. And that was sacred in the entire Sharia, which is not that it's one code for all, but it's a multitude of structured and self-organized faith communities which are being guarded and protected in their right to self-govern and celebrate God according to what they believe. So we have to come back to this idea, because if I go overly into the structure of a Sharia, then people who are scared of Sharia say, well, you want all of us to surrender, and that's not the case. So we have to come back to this idea of a respected plurality of, I don't know if you can call it pluralistic theocracy. ChatGPT says I could call it this, but I don't know if that's a real word. You're my philosopher, if there's such a term. But the plurality we have to come back to. Otherwise, everyone's mind will go to this system is dominating in the way that modern systems dominate, and it's not like that. And then last thing I'll say before I hand back to you, I know I've not gone into much of the details yet, but then when Mecca entered into Islam, which is the, let's say, 7th year after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ then just transported Medina to Mecca. Meaning, he came back to Medina, but he appointed a governor, which is a 20-year-old called Attab ibn Asid. Under the governor would have been organized Zakat. He appointed a head of the market. He appointed that the governor was in charge of Hajj. So now Hajj had a governor. What I'm trying to get at is the structure of Medina was to be copied wherever there was a faith community after Medina has come. There's a hadith that says La hijrata ba'd al-fath. There's no migration after the opening. And so when the tribes came into the other, when they came in the latter 2 years of the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to declare their allegiance, he would send back Medina. He would send them qadis. He would send Mu'adh as a zakat collector. He would send somebody as a governor. It was the civilization coming across Arabia. Wherever Islam went, structure went. And what does that mean? Micro Medinas wherever you are. That's the idea. It's a place-based code of creating a faith-based leadership which is responsible for upholding these fundamental institutions. That is what Sharia is, and that is what we have to build wherever we are to the best of our abilities.
I'm reminded of two things when you say about replicability. It's the fractals, which, they scale to whatever level, they look like the same, and it's the structure is replicable. It's also like the honeycomb. The basic structure is same, and then it replicates itself to become this holistic framework, which is optimized, which is stable, which is robust. But also, I am reminded of this conversation that I had with Dr. Yasir Qadi, and we did a podcast together, and I told him that my belief is that the only theological code of conduct which has legal pluralism, so to say, in the modern linguistics, embedded and theorized and, has theological value, is Islam, where you have, the Quran says, you introduce all of these universals, all of the rights, what Islam says to all of the people. But at the end of the day, to them their deen, to them their religion, and to your own if they don't agree. And then you establish a contract in terms of jizya for protection and let them have their space. So in the modern context, what we in constitutional theory call legal pluralism, that there is legality, there is supra-legal framework, which is the meta-legal framework of Islam, but there are micro legalities which are operating within that, of course with some level of restrictions in terms of what can be exported.
Just to be clear, when you said these micro legalities under that global legalities of Islam, just to be clear, that global legality just comes back to fundamentally protecting life and property, because it's not enforcing Islamic the beliefs that are for the Muslim community, which is structured by the Sharia, on the other faith communities. To the extent, I always give this example, and people might find it offensive, but in our Hanafi Fiqh book, in a chapter called, I think it's Nikah al-Mushrikeen, I can't remember now, but it's in the Hidayah, it's well known, it's like hidden doctrine, that the jurists are being told that you cannot interfere with the incestual marriages of the Magians because they are a protected faith community. So in our ethics, that's unethical. In our ethics, or in our, social acceptance or values, that's disgusting. But the law is saying you cannot interfere. It's part of their code. They are conducting these marriages in their places of worship, under their clergy, and we have promised them a safety, and that safety is not to interfere. And so that's why I said you be very careful. Everything there's an Islamic controlling, that's what everyone's terrified of, Sharia. But that's exactly what you've said. It's the only code. Again, I can't say that without studying all historical codes, but it's very hard to imagine another code which believes in a fundamental, demonstrable, non-relational truth claim, that there's a ultimate truth, and yet on the legal social plane, it condones and protects a regime of multiple truths in the legal sense. And so it's really important to really understand that. Going to Abu Hanifa, even, I'm sorry to be so specific in this very unpleasant topic, but if there's one couple in an incestual marriage, like a guy married his sister, and the sister comes to the Muslim Qadi, says, can you divorce me? Abu Hanifa says the Qadi's got no power to divorce her, because this was conducted in a protected faith community. Why are we interfering? Abu Hanifa only allows if both of the couple come to the Muslim judge and they say, can you give us a paper to separate us? Abu Hanifa says, fine, the Muslim judge can now separate as arbitrator of both parties. So it's really important to understand, even what you call an Islamic value on top, they are fully protected to buy and sell pork, to buy and sell wine. And so it's just to be really, really clear that the code on top really returns to protection of life and property as its fundamental purpose, which can involve things like prohibiting usury, by the way, because they felt that usury is prohibited by all ancient codes, and it undermines the safety of the market. So I just want to interrupt you at that one point. We can debate it further, but just so listeners don't get confused by what you've just said as well.
I have a different theory of this, that what has happened is the concepts of sovereignty and Darul Islam and Darul Herbs. Now we have to think in the way you're saying fractals. In the 2 kilometer radius that I'm in, the way that is organized, it's actually a map of Medina in a very extensive manner, that we are allowed to have this in a country like India. And so this 2 kilometer radius may be a Darul Islam, and then there will be a Darul Aman. And so you shouldn't think of it at a national scale only. You could reduce it to micro realities of, and people just, okay, it's this country versus that country. If you deconstruct that locality or that region, you would find different kinds of modes of being interacting together, and we should be more nuanced in terms of these relations.
The only thing I'd add, though, with the only, what can I say, qualification to a fractalization of this model, is the insistence of the thin layer of leadership as broadly as possible. Because the whole vision of this sacred law is creating jama'ah and the strength and protection and all the advantages that a jama'ah brings, or a group. So Mecca is still governed by Medina, although it's got its own sort of structure, Medina-like structure. Medina is, in the time of Sayyidina Umar, appointing the governors in Basra and Kufa and possibly firing them. But Basra and Kufa is fully self-governing within the structures of this blueprint. So it's just one thing to keep in mind. But why is the fractural thing also so important? What you're saying is that for the vast majority of Islamic history, the idea of a strong central government really dies out very early. So it's hard to say, the Umayyads, who people were not very fond of, they sort of persist this idea of a single global entity of some sort. But the Abbasids very soon on fractured in so many ways. And the caliphate became, for many people, a symbolic leadership. But the idea you've raised about the fractal allows that symbolic leadership to have a unifying, and you could still say consequential, purpose. So you've created now fluidity and therefore stability in this political imagination, that even if the center is compromised or weakened, it's fine. We've got the fractal structure, and we have a way to unify the fractures in some capacity under a unifying narrative. And that's created stability and a way to bring things back to center at a time or a place when that's possible. So just to say, we need to bring a unifying narrative, but still I agree with you that there's a power in this fracturing.
What you're saying, I call it transcendental contextualism. There's context, its all embedded realities, its all nuances, differences. Even then, there is a transcendental structure in terms of the algorithmic way in which you conceive the highest goal, and still it can have multiple manifestations in different contexts, different geographies, different localities, different group relations. So even if you have this relation between Hindu and Muslim, Muslim and Christian, Muslim and Jew, Muslim and Sabian, Muslim and atheist, Muslim and communist, Muslim and capitalist, all of these will have a transcendental relationship, but also a contextual relationship. That also follows from this, one of the things that struck me from the moment I heard you, because of my interest in philosophy, when we think about map of Medina, in my opinion, and I may be wrong about, I'm not a trained, scholar in tradition, but as far as I have read from my own philosophical perspective, I see the Medina, the Abyssinia, and the Makkah, and then the expansion as a continuum, in the sense that one is informing the other. And then, so for example, when you're in Makkah, the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, they're under the law of whatever governed Makkah at that time. It's like an oligopoly, very hierarchical society with mythified local sovereignty, and that the way he was dealing with that kind of structure, and when he was to govern the minorities, so there is a continuity in which the kind of dignity he gave in terms of the right that you said to govern themselves, to have a meaningful interpretation of what an individual or a collective or a group thinks of what their life is intended to do, despite the fact that there is always dawah, there is always the invitation towards what is right and what is wrong, but it is not imposed. So it comes from a very, bottom up, akhlaq oriented, where even in the free market that the Prophet introduced, the people get benefit from it. And then people from different ways in which they interact with the society, somebody is spiritual, somebody is economic, somebody is political, it is there they find meaning that Islam is giving the best of alternatives, and then people come to the fold. It has never been hardcore imposition the way people like to say when you start a Sharia, totalitarian, fascist frameworks. So I totally agree with you when you say that. And so the follow-up question then is, so when you say the map of Medina, Medina presupposes certain kinds of structures that the Prophet embodied in Misaq-e Medina, like a sort of a head of that state in terms of even the negotiations that different groups have. So in classical fiqh, when these discussions were, people were having these discussions between modern theologians and classical fiqh in the late 19th and early 20th century. So one of the questions people said, whenever people are invoking Medina, they're forgetting the part that the framework that is being given is from the Prophet himself, even when it is pluralistic. And so to be able to have that kind of model in a modern state, nation state, wherein almost always, even in Muslim contexts, where majority Muslim populations live, Medina in its first principle configurations of say 10 different axes that are required, 10 different first principles that are required to structure the Madinan polity, maybe 3 are fundamentally non-accessible. For example, sovereignty. For example, like you give the example of establishing Jummah when there is no, and in 20th century, even the classical jurists said that you can do it. So in that context, how do you fit this map of Medina, wherein these populations, Muslim populations, are configured into 200 different nation-state contexts?
So, we have to have the first step is fiqh, meaning trying to grasp what it is that the sacred law is saying. That's one part. Now we're almost bordering onto fatwa, meaning what do you tell people to do where they are? And what you tell people to do has to be informed by a broader vision, but the broader vision might not be what's possible now, and therefore the individuals can't be required to do that now, but rather it's taking society on a journey. That's why I said, if I collapse all of fiqh, I feel its simple sentence is, build Medina wherever you are to the best of your ability. And the last part's very important, because it shows that society building or civilization building is taking society on a journey. And societies are always on journeys. Every 10 years, ideas are shifting, what is current is shifting. So it's not that you're breaking a mold. Society is already on a journey. But can you be a positive agent to take societies to a better journey? And what I'd like us to start owning, and it's very tricky, is that the Sharia is a code for the betterment of all people and the dignity of all people and the protection of all people. Because of what you just said in your last comment, it's not dominating, it's actually protecting and preserving and empowering. What Sharia does that modern states don't do is that modern states, and I do subscribe somewhat to the core thesis of Professor Halak about the incompatibility of an ideal Sharia with an ideal modern, that there's a clash of control and low-key of power. Not saying that Muslims can't govern today, that's what people misunderstand, but just as when you think of ideals, that there's a variance within these ideals. So one thing that the Sharia does that modern states don't do is that modern states, because they are centralizing power, it's in their interest to weaken other loci of power. So in other words, small family is easier to govern than large family. And you'll find that the laws work to say that if you're in trouble, the state will help you, as opposed to saying, let's make your uncle help you, which strengthens family. The Sharia says, let's make your uncle help you. So the Sharia's laws are actually all strengthening loci of power that are non-governmental. And as you strengthen family, strengthen the legislating power of faith communities, you are creating these centers of authority that are not central government, and therefore you're actually protecting individuals. You're placing barriers on the penetration and power of government. And so it's a theory of protecting people. In an era where everyone is scared of totalitarian, everyone is scared of how technology is just accelerating a race of control, Sharia is a code of systems that can give more autonomy to people. That's why when I think through Sharia, although your question was right now in Muslim majority, if I think of Muslim minority, which is where I'm sitting right now, it really produces a very important and powerful narrative. Because not only are people uncertain how to respond to the centralizing power of these states, but now they're dealing with the question of these central states can't even look after us anymore. Health system not working, cost of living out of control, benefit system hard to access. There's this idea that power's been centered, we're being controlled by it, and it's not even looking after us. And so in a very delicate moment of fracture, which might be responded to by extreme totalitarianism, which is we're controlling all of you, stop complaining. Or it goes where is civilization going? We have to understand that this is not just a theoretical conversation that we're having today. It's not just a philosophical one. It's not just a faith one. It is one at a moment which can have great consequence for humanity. And we almost have to enter that arena by saying, we have something to offer. It's about, let's build structured communities. Let's put weight back into communities. Let's look after each other. Let's create our leadership structures. Let's create our welfare structures. Let's plug these gaps. And if you could have a Muslim community plugging its gap, which the local government can't cover, because in England, local authorities like Birmingham are bankrupt. And they're very Muslim populated. So if Muslims could say, don't worry, we have this. We're going to organize our welfare, our zakat, our Waqf, our this. Naturally, you're creating a shift of power, meaning now you are part of the governing of Birmingham because you have filled the gap. What you're doing is you are contributing to a future of society, which you can actually protect people's dignity better. You can say to your church networks, come, why don't you self-organize? Let's plug these gaps. Let's look after these asylum seekers which are being villainized, demonized, left with little, and they're human beings and they're in our societies. How do you solve this problem? So what I'm trying to say is this conversation is very real and palpable. And I'm sorry I've hijacked it with the minority example, but why did I say that is because our fuqaha say that even in a minority settings, Muslims should self-organize to the best of their ability. You don't have a Muslim government, but try to organize into some kind of Muslim council and appoint a Friday prayer leader, appoint a qadi, appoint the institutions which are the institutions of Medina then, to the best of your ability. That's why I add this clause at the end, to the best of your ability, you have to organize. And every struggle and weakness that I can see in Western Muslim and minority Muslim communities is the lack of the organizing vision. And the wider societies are scared, are you trying to organize and dominate? But that's where we have to lead with a deep understanding of our tradition, that it's through organization we represent the justice and mercy of our Prophet to these societies. It's not dominating and controlling, but it's how we contribute. Otherwise, we are scattered and not helpful contributors. So I'm sorry to take this in a different loop, but just to say that societies are all in flux. Societies are all in a journey forwards. In this current moment, our these modern states are really being stressed. And it's a moment between totalitarianism, authoritarianism, or another kind of civic responsibility that people have to start showing. It doesn't have to be presented as revolution. It could be presented as collaboration. But as you know, the moment you collaborate, power is being shared, always. If I collaborate with anybody, I'm sharing power with them. So it's not about, it doesn't have to be presented in anything other than a new form of civic, ethical collaboration to look after people, to fill gaps, to organize, to coordinate, and you're contributing to very real conversations without any of this having to sound threatening to anybody. It's what our faith tradition does. We are called to being active civic agents. That's what I called activism last time. I'll let you respond, and then maybe we can build on your question.
Actually, what you're saying is very prophetic in the sense the Misake Medina represents this, the treaty between different groups, and with the assurance that we're not going to take over each other, but we'll protect each other with the external threat and build Medina as, for everybody. So it's deeply prophetic what you're saying. It's anything less than that would be, actually in a way I'm thinking of it. Actually, the map of Medina is in a way, like you rightly argued, in whatever capacity and demography that you are organized in, you need to have some level of alignment, some level of collaboration, and that's what that ultimately leads to this leading towards a non-partisan society. Otherwise, people would always say, there's too much concentration of power there, there's too much wealth there. And with that regard, coming to the zakat, so mostly what happens is that it's a concentration of power, either in the form of military, in the form of information, in the form of wealth, in the form of political representation. That is where the societies start to really fracture. And historically speaking, there is a zone or a range in which even when people are oppressed, they can be contained. And it is, as you said, that the nations today are really going through that test of actually failing. And as I quoted the example of COVID, I remember in India when the COVID happened, so millions and millions of people were stranded in urban centers and they had to walk back almost 1,000 kilometers to their homes, walk literally. And these are poor agrarian working class laborers. And what was filling that gap was charity, bottom up, institutional, individual plus collective contribution in terms of the charity being able to move, say for example, hire a truck that people can board in and go, get some food that can be distributed. And zakat in that sense is these kinds of failures that happen in the market. What is zakat? In a framework where when you go through these stress moments in society, and how does zakat in Islam has organized it for every kind of situation you're in. It's not as if when you will be in stress, then you have to go through this. It is institutionalized in the very nature of redistribution in Islam.
Okay, now that's a very big question, and you could tackle it in very, very, very many ways. I would like to go back to the model we've been starting with, just to develop it in abstraction. And then when you want to, then bring it into the world. The abstraction I'm going to suggest right now, maybe we can discuss it in the levels of minority, majority again. And then we'll come back if you think that's answered your question. So in the level of abstraction, for just the idea of zakat, zakat is taxation. It's incorrect to not call it that. Because because if we remember that Medina is what the Sharia is modeling, in Medina, zakat had all the features of taxation. But taxation within this notion of a pluralistic, structured set of faith communities overseen by this central body, if you like. So zakat within that space was specific within the structure of the Muslim community. That explains why most scholars saw it as a payment from Muslim to Muslim. Because if it's a society of multiple communities, structured and organized, and if faith, this is the hardest thing when you want to map a classical Sharia vision for society into the modern world, then the hardest units to deal with is how faith was envisaged to be a fundamental unit of social organization, which it isn't anymore. That's probably the biggest question when you struggle with some of the implementing or bringing these into the modern context. So in the old world, or the vision of how the Sharia is documented and recorded in its books, being Christian or being Jew or being Muslim is part of your, it's not just a personal choice. It will inform where you're going to wed and inform what kind of laws might apply to you, and will inform what form of welfare, what notions of welfare you'll pay into and tap into. And so it informs a lot about you in the world, much more than anything we'd imagine today. And so zakat is for the people whose identity in society is Muslim. And then for those people, it's an organized tax regime, meaning there were collectors. They would document, they would record, they would gather, they would guard, they would distribute, and it would repeat, just like a tax would. But unlike a tax, it's a tax in a civilization that's not fundamentally secular. It's fundamentally custodians under God. And that's why this pluralism is so important to understand, going back to this pluralism, because any human being, any human system which believes in a truth claim naturally wants to dominate. Truth must prevail. And that's why this system isn't doing that. It has a fundamental truth claim, but it's under God. And God has said, you are custodians who protect. That's it. And in obedience to God, there's this protection that we've been stressing about all faith communities. And so if you like, it's God's tax regime for this Muslim community. And so the government can't determine the tax rate. And that's part of the system. I said, why Sharia is so relevant in today's anti-totalitarianism conversations is because Sharia at its core is limiting government all the time. It's limiting the tax rate. It's limiting where the tax can go. It's limiting what kind of taxes may be raised. It's limiting when a government is overstretching in taxation. The whole system is protecting people and limiting the possibilities of authoritarianism. We really have to bring that about into real conversations today, not just theoretical faith conversations that we might currently be having. Coming back to this then, it's a tax under God, and so the government or the tax authority, let's call it that, can't determine anything other than the fact that it's duty bound to collect and redistribute. That's the first step. It's centralized. Then within this is the idea of why, within this then is two things, is that our scholars of fiqh say at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr and Umar, may Allah be pleased with them, all of zakat was centrally collected and distributed. After Sayyidina Uthman, they say there was a distinction between public and private wealth. Public wealth was agriculture and animal livestock. Private wealth was about gold, silver and trade items. I believe the distinction was partly because it protects individuals from the tyranny of government, meaning a government would never enter your house to count your money. You count your own money. The government will not count your private wealth or take stock of it. You count it and you're trusted to declare it and spend it. And when you spend that zakat, you can give it to a government collector or you give it yourself directly. So then zakat becomes two-tiered. A part that you have agency to give directly and a part that is still centrally collected, accounted for and distributed. This then takes us to the next conversation about localization. All the fiqh schools say that the sunnah of zakat is it's all distributed. The wealth collected in a town or city is distributed in that town and city. There's some small debates about can you still take it out if there's greater need or if your relatives are there. So that's fine. So I'm not saying zakat is only in a town, but in its sunnah, it's structured within a town. Now you've come to that idea, then you can come to the next idea. That zakat according to the sunnah is one of the most important engines of creating the form of structured community that we've been labeling as building Medina. And that's what tax always does. Tax is one of the most important features of showing the legitimacy and authority of a government. Because it means that you can exact money from a population who then can make demands of you to represent them. That contract, that political contract, is expressed through taxation. And so now we've shown how Zakat is this sort of place-based structured system. You can see why it's the most important engine to moving towards the sort of ideal we've only hinted at. Again, we've not gone into great detail about, but that's why I'd say it's necessary for us to start thinking about how to organize our societies just to serve this pillar of Zakat, because it's the accelerator of everything else we've talked about. In other words, can we organize Zakat in a unit? Whether the unit is Delhi, or the unit is a state in India, or the unit is a part of an area, can we start structuring? Can we start organizing? Can we create a leadership that we can trust? A leadership we can give our money to and they can distribute? Can we make sure that Muslims, wherever they're living in a place, they are known, their needs are known and identified, their needs are cared for? Because then you're really fixing a place and you're creating structure and leadership. That's important for the next step. Lastly, I'll say, and I'll hand back to you, Zakat is not exclusively the structure within place. Givers do have an agency. So I believe we have to build the structure in place and we have to leave givers with their agency. How much of their own Zakat they want to put within their local city or town structure. How much of their own Zakat they want to take further afield to relatives they might have or other links they might have that they wish to contribute to. So I don't want to say that Zakat is illegitimately transported to other places. No, there is a legitimacy in that. But Zakat as a system should also be developing our communities, because that's the Sunnah and that's how Zakat came into the world.
I just want to, exactly come to that. So, in the Madinan context, and the Prophet, when he organized this structure, the collectors were taking all of this money to this organized framework in which who was leading the distribution and selection of where to be spent is Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the leaders he appointed. So in that sense, Zakat in the Madinan model is state bound, say for example. And if it's state bound and it has certain categories like Asnaf, 8 categories where you can spend it. So there is minimization in a certain sense of the agency to utilize it in a way and manner that you would like it from a very, individualistic perspective. But the way we are attuned to using Zakat in like India and other places is like there is a nisab, the minimum threshold after which your surplus wealth needs to be taxed, say for example 2.45%, and then you spend it according to your own understanding of these 8 categories, to your local masajid, to somebody you think is in need. So these are 2 very different ways in which the zakat is organized. And then there's this middle way in which, even your experience with National Zakat Foundation or organizations here who prefer to structure themselves into NGOs or local, Islamic bodies, and they take the zakat from you on your behalf and then they spend it. So it's like a middle way. So in the Indian context or even in the global context, the problem that we face in the hyper-individualization, atomization of zakat as this model, where the 8 categories I see are these frameworks within a nation state or an organized polity, where the institutions of economy, the institutions of political representation, the institutions of education, the institutions of banking and debt, these markets fail. And it's the correction of these markets through the surplus wealth collected from the community itself and restructuring those asymmetries into potentially uplifting frameworks for everybody involved in that society. So in that context, how do you see the institution building of zakat, which was embodied in the Madinan model as a state paradigm, while it was already said 2-3 years before, as was the case in Makkah for organizing into prayers, zakat was also the ayahs were revealed, although it was never collected before reaching the Madinah, but the context was set about charity, about zakat, the rate was not set. But there was this, that is why I personally feel that the Madinah is the manifestation of the will of Makkah, wherein the minority context in which we demanded plurality, we demanded agency to carve out our roots towards truth and to be able to say it out loud. For me, it's a continuum of mapping of that will into the foundational institutional structures of where you got the potential to build frameworks. So, for example, in the Madinan model of the prophetic time, there were certain structures in which you could organize. And now, in the modern context, you have NGOs, you have, say, for example, local, so many things, and you have different modes of organizing. How do you map that? How do you make zakat from a first principles perspective of its original application in a certain way to recontextualizing it, to abstracting it out of that context to anywhere as a solution towards community needs?
No, I found it very beautiful what you said about Medina as the manifestation of the will of Mecca. I find that very, very beautiful and very, very fair. And it shows that there's no rupture. What I struggle with sometimes is people saying minorities are more in Mecca, we have to go back to Mecca. And the problem with that is, are you going to leave Jumu'ah and Zakat and Hijab and, how that's this hadith, I'm using it broadly, La hijrata ba'd al-fath, like the opening has come, you can't now discard that. You can't discard the fact that clarity has come, which people had been seeking. All you have to do is understand that clarity that has come, it's your core question right now. How does it be applied to where you are? That's the question. You can't say after Medina there is no Medina. You can't say that now. That's why symbolically our calendar is only Medina. It's Medina until the end.
And you have also answered that question in a way, if I recall our conversation. When the Medina is taken back to Makkah, it's that mapping that was done from Makkah to Medina, institutionalized in Medina, and then remapping it to the Makkah. So, in my understanding of how I read you, from the first moment I've heard you, is this constant question in back of my mind: how do I treat, from the very moment the Prophet got the wahi to the last moment of his life, all those 23 years are sacred, and how do I abstract all of it in a way that I can reconfigure it wherever needed in all of these contexts, which you won't find being mapped exactly to the way chronologically it mapped to the prophetic time. You will find ingredients mixing and mapping. And for that, you will have to abstract it to the level that you have all the meta theory of 23 years, and you can always apply anything everywhere given the context which elements are being configured. So I read you in that manner. So even though when you say map of Medina, it gets translated in me as the manifestation of those foundations willed into institutional frameworks and then re-importing them to other places.
Very fair, Samar. And what you've summarized is what the meaning of fiqh is really meant to be. Because fiqh is meant to mean deep understanding. And because what you've talked about, Mecca, Medina, Medina, Mecca, is not about ethics or being good to parents or being good to neighbors or telling the truth. It's not about arguments of is God one and how can you show that, or how do you relate to nature. Can you see? It's a very specific context in which your question is coming. And it's the context of civilization actually in society. And so the science for that is fiqh. But unfortunately, when fiqh is professionalized, it's teaching, repeating, rinse, repeating, is this idea. But really, the journey to fiqh is to journey to a deep understanding of what is the sacred code. Because if you can penetrate the letters to the understanding, then it has to enable what you're saying. Applying the understanding to every place to the best of your ability. And that's what the early fuqaha did. That's why, my own training is in the fiqh of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa, I have an article. I believe he's the founder of fiqh as a formal discipline, and it's because I demonstrate to the best of my ability that he was the first person in history to ask forensic questions of the law. Like, if you take a topic, multiple what if, how, what's the purpose of forensic questioning? It's to be able to identify and articulate the deep meanings of every topic. And that's the beginning of deep theory, meaning real comprehension as a discipline. And I believe that the books of the tradition are for that purpose, but it's just we have to arrive at fiqh, reacquaint ourselves with fiqh. So what you're saying is not abstract philosophy, it is fiqh. And we just have to come back to fiqh and to use the very same tools whose purpose is exactly what you've said. Anyway, I just want to say that fiqh is the label in me for the diagram in you when you talk to me while I'm talking to you. Just awareness.
That makes me very confident because in the traditional ways, if you're not trained into traditional ulooms, then you're rejected outrightly. So that's how. So we have this recorded now. I can use it. That somebody who spent 10 years of his life studying tradition, he said this. Alhamdulillah.
Now back to your actual question, which we have to remember it. But uh, one thing I wanted to say clearly when you say how do we actually bring it about now, we're talking about roadmaps, and there's no one clear answer on roadmaps, but it's really important for us to get through our psyche of the entire Muslim community, which is that to be a Muslim is to be a cross-generational civilization builder. What do I mean by that? Because what's the most basic expression of Islam? You have a family. The family is structured. There's a head, there's responsibilities. Okay. Then what's the next expression? You go to the mosque. The mosque is structured. Move as one behind a leader. The problem is, as a community, our imagination stops at the mosque. But that we treat the mosque as exceptional. But no, the mosque is the entire Sharia. Medina is nothing more, if you want to say the will of Mecca, Medina is nothing more than the will of the mosque. Or if at least the organizing of a Muslim community is nothing more than what the mosque represents. Just take the mosque, take it into welfare and you get zakat. Take it into justice and you get the qadi. Take it into the market and you get a market inspector. And so it's just, we've forgotten that it's intrinsic. To be a Muslim is to be a social creature. To be a Muslim is to understand how to talk your differences and reach resolution. To be a Muslim is to understand that you reach resolution by appointing a leadership. And to be a Muslim is to understand that that's a leadership that is never absolute, it's held to a particular standard. It's the most fundamental education of all of Islam. So we just need to bring that back home, basically. It's not a Zakat is calling for it or a theory of Medina is calling. No. That's it. That's what it's all about. That's this vision, the will of Mecca. In Medina, it's one thing, manifest. But we just have to get it to the most basic core of our education, because that's the thing that we've forgotten. Because what's happened is this global Muslim community railing from, multiple, a few centuries now of colonization and loss of central. We're on this journey back to find ourselves. And we have to understand that finding ourselves has to be not in the abstract space of ideation, which is important, but it has to be in the social space of collaboration, coalition, leadership, and moving. Otherwise, if we refuse to come together in our places, and I always emphasize place-based, because it's in place that you live in reality. Everything else is just a relation, but place is where life happens. And Sharia is place-based. If we cannot understand the duty of forming coalition and leadership to live our faith in place, we are the first people to betray Medina. And we can have all the ideation and pontification that we like, but we are the people betraying it. That's just a fundamental point of education we have to have. Then we can talk about roadmaps, but what you respond, and we'll come back to your question.
So, before asking you your National Zakat Foundation experience, there's one last question I want to ask about Zakat. What is Zakat correcting in terms of inequalities, in terms of what is it solving as a problem?
Again, I think there's multiple answers to this based on who and how you ask this question. I, for the longest time, avoided the word inequality because I didn't know its philosophical trajectory. When I heard it, it seems to imply inequality is bad and equality is good. And that's not a Sharia framing. I've started using it now because I understand that it's addressing mass, extreme, unprecedented inequality. So I've started using it now. But I just want to say, I don't know its trajectory, and we just want to, we're not calling for equality. To stick to the frame we've been discussing today, which is by no means the only frame, but to stick to the frame we've been discussing today, Zakat is creating at its core a particular human being. And this human being is being educated in understanding a few basic principles. Those principles include: you are not the owner of your wealth. You are the trustee over your wealth, which you are entrusted over, you could say, God's wealth. Allah has given you this. And Allah has given you free reign, free authority to choose how you spend your wealth. But within that, He has placed a tax on this wealth, which is a right of the needy, within your faith community, which I still have to come back to. So that's one idea, that a trustee with a right. And if you don't see the right, the whole wealth is polluted. You are the beneficiary of Allah's tax, if you like. You want it. That's one piece of education. And each of these things develop a kind of human. Okay, next step. Next step is, let's look at the step of faith first of all. You are living, your relationship to Allah necessarily leads to a particular relationship with those who believe in Allah, a particular relationship. That relationship is real, and you have to feel a special tie in that relationship by spending this money there. So it's another piece of education about something about the meaning of ummah. Well, next step. Because Zakat is, as an institution, localized, then you are then being trained in another thing. You are responsible for the needs of the people around you. That is a fundamental piece of education that the modern human being is denied. Because a modern human being is told, your education is for self-expression, self-actualization. The people in your area are not your responsibility, they're the government's responsibility. So can you see, there's another human being being created in modern education. In Zakat education, the human being is told, you are responsible for the well-keep of the people around you. Another piece of education is, you are part of an orderly faith community, and you have to engage with those structures. So it's about civilization, it's about responsibility, it's about ethics of wealth, and it's about a duty of care. Now, it's really important to understand, Zakat is just a little bit of a person's duty to God. It's a very small amount of a very particular kind of wealth. It's only the beginning of one's giving. It's the beginning of one's entering this society. It's not the end of it. But the human being that Zakat is creating naturally then is being taken on a journey in that education. A journey of responsibility to place, responsibility to people who are struggling, and a journey of wanting to give more. Because if you look at the civilization Zakat unlocked, its great champion was actually Waqf, which has nothing to do with Zakat. But the idea is that a civilization that sees a duty of pooled wealth and solving real problems in place is then what gets unlocked in them is my worth as a human being is what I can leave behind for the public good. And when you unlock that within the psyche of people, they all want to give more. That's not restricted to Zakat rates. I'll give half my business to this mosque. I'll give half my farmland to that women's shelter. I'll give. When you unlock this education, you end up in a society which is paradigmatic for Muslims all over the Muslim world. You have free schools, free hospitals, free lodging, free, not paid by tax, not paid by government, but unleashed by a particular kind of human being. So I say zakat is creating all of this, but we have to see zakat not just as a thing to get done, but as a system we have to serve educationally and systemically in the way that we've been discussing. That's one part. Another part of what zakat is achieving just through its rules is that no one should be sitting on liquid wealth. Either circulate it through the real economy or give a share of it to the poor. That's it. That's how it works as a pure economic agent. Because I could get out of zakat by investing in businesses, investing in other matters, but then wealth will be circulating. So don't sit on liquid assets. Circulate it in risk ventures, essentially, or give some of it to the needy.
Also, in the larger Islamic economic paradigm, so when you're spending and you don't have the time to invest in every venture you do, then you end up having a contract with somebody of the nature where you risk share, where you profit share. So it is not as if you can keep on accumulating it. You're increasing the velocity of money, you're increasing the distribution of in terms of the modern economy, the capital owner, ends up accumulating wealth over time, and it is not taxed. In the Islamic economics framework, you cannot sit on wealth. So if you're sitting on wealth, anyways, it is not giving you anything. Whenever you will sell it, you'll have to give zakat. So either you spend it or you invest it. And if you invest it, you are entering into a kind of contract which is not the kind of contract that the modern world offers, where labor is always subservient to the capital. You have a equivalent of a sort of contract. So in that sense, in the larger paradigmatic Islamic economics framework, it's at every level wherein if you see from the totalitarian perspective of power, the way economic power can be totalized and then used to totalize politics, to totalize society, to totalize culture, all of it is reversed even from zakat as an institution. And it can begin, as you say, from bottom up. You don't require sovereign political structures to do that. You can do it from the level of your existence in a place as small communities.
I think I want to say that, first of all, one other benefit also, as we're talking about just what does zakat achieving, is it reframes the relationship between the rich and the poor, in the sense that the poor are not a burden, but they're the means through which your wealth is purified. And the Sharia does that all of the time. If you can't fast, well, the poor will save you. You messed up on Hajj, don't worry, the poor will rescue you. You've found something lost, you have a duty to pick it up, lost property. You can't find the owner, what do you do with it? Don't worry, give it to somebody poor and they will cleanse and it can become back into society. So the poor are economic saviors in this moral understanding of money. And so it changes lots of things in lots of perceptions. Coming to your second point, because we have to talk about, I've dodged a lot your main question about Muslim majority political, the politics part of it, and I kept hijacking it almost, come back to a minority sense. But we need to talk about this, to be fair, which is, if zakat starts as taxation, then zakat starts in Medina, then it is top down. And the top down structure is diffused, community based, honeycomb like. So that's why the top down structure maintained the thing that we're talking about. Now, what could all of that mean today in engaging with modern Muslim political structures? I do not have a clear answer. So it would be very, very helpful to study and survey different expressions of zakat management in today's diffused multinational Muslim world. I know that Malaysians have a very interesting model where zakat is managed at the level of state. And every state has its own central body, and it has and there's a very good tax incentive. If you pay zakat to your state collector, then you don't pay that amount in income tax. And so because it's so embedded in the tax regime, then they collect a lot of money, and they're very, really a lot of money goes to the state collector. Then the 1/8, that is the what the state collector can take, that they invest in awqaf, and so it's become this big, it's quite a big entity of how they're working. They themselves have their own successes and struggles of how the community perceives them, or how people get more involved. So they're asking, so they're still evolving how people can take part, to feel more part of this entity. So it's good to study that. Singapore has probably a fabulous example of a Muslim minority whose leadership structure is embedded formally within government. So in Singapore, there is a Minister of Muslim Affairs. He's actually, it's a position in government. And under the minister is this body, I think Majlis Ulama Islam Singapore, they call it Nous. And that body is the official zakat collector of this Muslim minority. And because it's official and centralized in the same way, because they have also a Grand Mufti of Singapore for the minority tied to this structure, then whatever zakat debates, it will be settled, if you like, centrally. They collect across categories, they have investments, and so it's an example of how an embedded structure would work. But again, like all embedded structures, there'll be people who talk about its successes and people who are not fond of some of its manifestations, like all structures will have. Pakistan, I don't know enough about at all. I was in the middle of a conversation with the podcast there, which will continue. I know that at the time it was collected just by the bank through a central government, and I know that maybe wasn't as popular. I heard people declare themselves as Shia to avoid that. I don't know the details of it. I know that in many other Muslim majority countries, there is no formal governmental zakat collection. There's just private charities who are not then doing zakat as system. They're just facilitating the spend of zakat, which is not the same as what we've been talking about today. They're more like agents of givers. They're not any sort of systemic or systematic zakat solution. They're occupying a middle space, which doesn't address most of the topics we've been raising today. But I do know if somebody were to try to, in those countries, say, okay, let's start organizing zakat in a place, that would be seen, yeah, but has the awqaf signed you off? Like, have you worked with the Ministry of Religious Affairs? What are you trying to do exactly? Do you have a license for this? And so you'll have to, in every place, understand the systems at play and understand the best way to develop a journey towards zakat in a way that realizes some of the objectives we'll be discussing today. So I think it's a country by country conversation which needs country by country nuance. But the advantage we have, which maybe we can start today and maybe we can pick up, as you see fit, is both of us represent minorities. And I'd love to have a conversation of where you see India, how zakat is in India today and where you think it could go. I would love to hear your thoughts on that or to learn from that.
You mentioned survey. We're planning in the next couple of months to survey 3 kinds of localities. One is a rural Muslim place-based context. The other is a town-based. The other is urban ghetto. So how is zakat being utilized? In what way and manner? And can we introduce institutions which can probably in 10 years, 25 years down the line, systematically improvise a certain speciality, a space-based solution. And I was having this conversation with my chat GPT and I said that which are the best zakat-based models out there in the world. So it gave me 5. The first was Malaysia, the second was Indonesia, third was I think Singapore, then another Indonesia. Indonesia has one which is centralized and the other which is more like a semi-centralized structure. So they have 2 models working parallelly. And then, I was doing my homework in a place like India. How do you structure it? If you have a National Zakat Institute in India, which has multiple pillars. One is the pillar of surveying and giving vision roadmaps through surveys and analysis of a locality with masjid and other centers in collaboration. The second is, how do you have a aggregator layer in terms of digital infrastructure wherein you are not trying to totalize zakat infrastructure, but what you're doing is organizing whatever is happening, and the receivers and the givers are mapped on some level of digital layer where there is mobility, you know where it goes, there's some kind of habit building of asnaf, potentiality of showing how you can improvise in this locality for 10 years through the research, then through the digital based infrastructure of behavioral change, and that infrastructure has relation with local. Say for example, you met the head of Imarat Sharia. So there is head of Jamiyat Ulama, there is head of Jamaat Islami, there is head of different organization, and you're just giving them the operational layer wherein they can efficiently mobilize things within their own context. And then you have zakat councils in districts, which creates Waqf like institutions of community centers where all of these activities live, including base layer where actually you are renting out. That's what India is. We did a documentary on Fatehpuri Mosque. In all of Indian Mughal architecture, you would find a mosque with shops in its vicinity, earning revenue through those shops, reinvesting that into the zakat categories, but also building infrastructure. So you would have a school, you will have a madrasa, you will have a cemetery, you will have all of these things within that compound. And so how do you that's what we are trying to think in Indian context, especially in an antagonistic environment. How do you rebuild where Waqf is almost dead, where zakat is so dispersed that even you don't know where your own zakat is going, despite knowing that you are more concerned, more conscious about that, because there is no institutional framework where you can put your money. So in that context, how is National Zakat Foundation solving the problem in UK context? What are your learnings, and what do you think can be exported universally in whatever state structure is the universal thing you could do?
Thank you for that question. And I definitely want to say that National Zakat Foundation is on a journey. So it's not to say that we have the final model and we've solved all the puzzles. It is a journey because there's a few factors here. And I want to also bring in another question I was about to ask you as well, that as we just focus on our two countries, India and UK, let's forget the rest for now. We also have to understand, how do you build something that not only, because the success requires participation, right? I can build the best thing, but if people don't participate, then it's not worth anything. So the idea is not just what's a nice idea of a system, but it's the whole human element. How do you create broad participation? The larger the participation, the greater the consequence of what you've built, right? So that's one puzzle, participate within the Muslim community. But there's another puzzle in both of our contexts we have to think about. How do you present this thing that you're building as an advantage for larger society? Because if what you're building is seen as a threat to larger society, then you're not going to succeed. And I'm not saying pretend it's an advantage and really it's a threat. I'm not saying that. We have to really start thinking of the way we started today. If Sharia really is an advantage for humanity, then we have to understand how organizing our zakat in place is seen as an advantage. Because what will drive success in this project is that the Muslim community finds broad participation in and representation by, and wider society finds great advantage in this happening. So that the road is open, if you like, to really create something of consequence, and not something of a few people like what you have. This is the first thing. And so really there's multi-layers of human thinking, and not just about how to handle zakat and report to givers. That's just a very basic element of this puzzle. So within that, let me just say a few simple layers of our journey. NZF in the UK is 15 years old. It has led to the birth and growth of NZF in other countries. So there's Australia, Canada, those are a little bit older. New Zealand, Netherlands, a little bit newer. And if you like very new, is New Zealand and Germany. And so we would like to support this sort of work in other countries and territories in whichever capacity we can help. So it's like, it is a global vision of organized, localized, place-based zakat systems. That is the idea. Now within the UK, So the first hurdle is getting people to understand that there's need within the UK, because I'm talking about the human hurdles, right? Because the humans say, well, we live in a welfare state, it's a well-to-do country, all of our zakat's been going to places, why are you collecting it for the UK? Who are you working for? What's your motive? all of these things. And what's helped our cause is that, again, it's a bad news that helps the cause. It's just the recognition across UK society that there's gross, huge inequality, many people below the poverty line. 1 in 3 UK children suffer from some definition of poverty. The Muslim community is the most impoverished of UK's faith communities. So the data from wider society is just becoming quite clear as time is going on. But that's a hurdle of localization. Why should we change our giving patterns? Why give here? That becomes a hurdle. As you then pass through that hurdle, you then have to talk about fiqh. That's it. I'm talking just within the human. And so I believe if your goal is a national structure, you have to work with fiqh at a level that everyone can accept and understand. In other words, don't be so creative in your personal ideas. Work on a thing that everyone can work with, and just create something of trust. Because trust building is the most important thing here. Because we're not doing it through top-down imposition in our two contexts. Okay, now you're working with the fiqh that people understand. Now you've got people thinking, fine, I should be giving back. Now you've got a moral narrative. I'm responsible for people around me. Okay, now you've developed all of that. Then you go to systems of distribution. Let's say now we come up with ways to help people. We currently help with cash giving and hardship and housing support and training to get into employment. Could be other ways of intervention can be thought about. But let's just say you have interventions that solve the problem everyone agrees to. Fine. Then you have to come to trust and reporting. That's where technology can be very helpful. You can demonstrate where money has gone. You can tie givers to recipients. You can give reports. You can have auditing. You can show transparency. You can register, because anyway, you have to register with a government charity commission here. So you have oversight through an official structure. You can create other forms of oversight. So we have our own independent Sharia body that does checking on us. We have our own independent audits that we also pay for in addition to the governmental audit. So that's all creating trust. So you've created trust, you've created transparency, you've created reporting, you've built out the narrative. Now all that's left is the conversation you and I have been having, because I believe if you want to have mass participation, I don't believe human beings will ever mass participate for some independent charity. Like, I'm loyal to NZF. What does that mean? What is NZF to me? I'm just a person. A person on the street would say. And so I believe if you want to really create the system we've been discussing, it's by actually building that system. Meaning, if you start really localizing and you say, well, everyone's zakat is going back to the city that you're from. If you start what we've started doing now, so we now, through our technology, any zakat you give online will match it to a recipient from your locality before matching it to any other recipient. So we're creating, even through online virtual giving, the idea of you're helping locality, the narrative of locality. We've started now partnering with mosques, so that mosques in your locality are handling the funds that are being collected and working with community. So that leads to more ownership. Now the mosque can start telling the stories, that it's real. It's not, because no one trusts. We're a very suspicious community, especially we're British and Muslim. So there's a cynicism in being British. There's a sort of suspicion. So when you bring it all together, it's the perfect cloud of suspicion, which is fine. It's just a culture in our community. I think other communities might be more naturally trusting. And so in this space, then people won't trust a charity saying it, but they might trust their local people that they know saying, no, I volunteer here, I met people in need and we're helping them. So that's just the idea of encouraging more participation through more ownership. The next step we're trying to do now is, can we bring multiple actors together, maybe mosques and other sort of experts, to create a sort of leadership forum over a place like Birmingham to start strategizing for Muslim welfare. So now we can start thinking about moving the whole conversation forwards about Muslim welfare in that place. If we could do that, then I think you can encourage another kind of participation. And you've created leadership, right? That's what the Medina thing was about, around welfare. Because it's around welfare, that's what solves the external puzzle. Because now you've created a head that can now start speaking to local authorities, local government, and be a partner in broader welfare conversation. You can say, this is what we've done with our Muslim community. These are our systems. How can we partner with you in creating a broader system for Birmingham or for London? So you can see we are collaborating. We've created a head that didn't exist with work that wasn't happening to solve a problem that everybody had to solve. And so what you've done there is, again, you've given authority to this leadership, which is going towards the Medina for the Muslim community. And you've created a collaborator and a needed partner for wider society. And so then we'll see the rest of this journey. And if you could connect these nodes, then you've gone very close to everything we've been discussing today, basically. That's our next work that we're doing here, but always in the spirit of being a public collaborator, which is why we've also decided to start collecting non-zakat money, so we can use the same systems for non-Muslims who are also neighbors to these mosques and centers, that we are really creating systems that don't yet exist, which everyone can benefit from. So we have to always think of how we a public solution as well as a Muslim coordinating structure. Last thing I'll say to you before I hand back to you, and I appreciate, I think we've also, I've spoken a lot into the time, but then this system, I feel, can be transported in whichever way a people wish to practice it. So someone from Florida reached out to us. The conversation stalled at the moment, but I thought, okay, you're coming from a community level. Let's give you some of our community solutions. I spoke to another group from America and I thought, actually, no, we could create a national body and work with community bodies. You might be in that Imarat structure. Let's work with the Imarat structure. So, because these are units, right? The mosque solution is a unit. The digital matching is a unit. The creating a forum is a unit. How to have forums communicating with local government is a unit. These are units of products. And we should be able to help communities in whichever unit or product can help them. And that's the hope of our, if you like, global NZF vision. So we have like a NZF worldwide. The global vision is how can we then support all communities globally in ways that we can help them in this.
My final question would be about the organizational structure of NZF, because you can't, I mean, it is part of my research. It's one place that you're saying that the miraculous part of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's contribution is to create a role-based system also. So it's the roles that creates the structure. So it's not just the institutional framework in terms of the ideas, but who is going to embody certain responsibilities to be able to achieve that idea. So in terms of NZF, what is the structure? So because it's this structure that gets replicated, and in terms of this structure, then working towards the end of the categories and local context in which, say, for example, the 8 categories might translate differently in UK. And they might, translate differently in India. And even in India, they might translate differently in Delhi as compared to, say, Lucknow, say, Birmingham versus London. So the local geography or the local place has its own problems. And so in that context, the distribution of those funds can vary. And even the way they are understood, the categories, they might differ. So how do you structure such an organization in terms of being able to conceive and then deliver that change?
So again, maybe there's more than one way to answer your question. We're currently working at the level of country, and we're developing our ability to work at the level of locality, which is what I'm calling local leadership or representative councils and so on. That's a new journey. We're just at the beginning of that, just to be very clear. So NZFs are currently organized at the level of countries. And in every country, we're encouraging them to have a local scholarly panel to advise them, which can reflect the local scholarly context in the way that you're saying. As we're going towards building these local structures and bodies, we first have to create that trust, and that's the next step. And then we'll see after that to address some of the questions that you're raising.
Thank you, Dr. Sohail, Hanif. And I'm sure the kind of work that the NZF is doing, and more than that, I always, from a philosophy perspective, I always, see there's a relationship between an individual and an organization. So sometimes individuals lead organizations, and sometimes organizations build individuals. And the Prophet is both of them at the same time. So the traditional Jamaats, they are organization over individual, and the modern Muslim thinkers are individuals over organizations. Both of them have failed to work because the world is it's a individuality producing plurality. It's an individuality creating community, but also community shaping the individual. And so until unless we conceive that relationship as an organism, as an interplay, we might not be able to really institutionalize these ideas. So it's a very humble experience knowing how you do it in your lived experience. And Jazakallah khair for your time and for further future conversations.
My apologies to anyone listening, because the topic is very broad, and I'm answering it from the point of view of what are the most salient features in my reflections, and that's not at all to do justice to the larger topic of zakat or the sacred law. So this is just to point out some of the narrowness of what otherwise could have been broader. Your point on the intellectual humility, I'm grateful for your point, but there is something real in what you're saying, which is in the sort of direction of travel that we've been discussing today, where we are as a global community trying to reorient, refine, and rebuild. Our leaders will be the ones who know how to build bridges. Our leaders will not be the ones who break the bridges. And I think that's what you're getting at. And as a feature, this is absolutely correct. It won't work any other way.